I've been coming to Singapore for a long time, not when it was 5 years old, as it says in the program, but certainly when it was only 7 years old. I've been coming here for 43 years. And I'm really pleased to be able to speak about 1965 because I've just come from the Ubud Riders Festival in Indonesia, and at the moment, 65 was an important year in Indonesia as well, but you certainly can't mention it in Indonesia. It's a blacklisted word right now. But I came here by the Magic Bus. A few weeks ago, I was presenting a Radio 2 program with the BBC in London. We were talking about the music of the Magic Bus era, the hippie trail that took you across Europe and across Asia. And here's my Magic Bus. Maureen, my wife, and I bought that car in London in 1972 for about $150. And it was so cheap, we decided we'd just drive it as far east as it went. And if it broke down somewhere, we'd just walk away from it. Didn't get us quite to Singapore. And it got us, first of all, across Europe to Istanbul. And Istanbul is that city that straddles Europe and Asia. If you look at it from above, you've got Asia at the top of that screen off to the right, and on the left, you've got Europe. And at 72, there were no bridges across the Bosphorus. There wasn't a tunnel under the Bosphorus. You had to get in a ferry, and you had this real feeling of transition. You were moving from Europe to Asia. We carried on across Turkey. Any biblical scholars out there will know that Mount Ararat was where Noah is supposed to have landed his ark. It was the first land that appeared above the water after the 40 days and 40 nights of biblical floods. We continued into Iran, went down to Isfahan, the city that Persians say is half the world. I've been back to Iran in subsequent years, but certainly if Maureen was back now, she'd have to be covering her hair and couldn't be wearing blue jeans. We got to Afghanistan, and in Kabul in Afghanistan, a $150 car, and it gets you all the way from London to Kabul, and we sold it for a $5 profit. Now, I've been saying for years that was probably Osama bin Laden's getaway vehicle, and if the Americans had just tracked that car down, they wouldn't have had to go to all the trouble they did finding him. So we crossed into Pakistan without the car, India, up to Kathmandu, and I spun the prayer wheels around the Bodhanath Stupa. Now, in 1972, Kathmandu had some very interesting shops. Of course, we never inhaled, but those stores were there in 72. Back into India, across to Bangkok, and by this time the money was beginning to run a bit low, so we started hitchhiking. And we hitchhiked from Bangkok down through Thailand, into Malaysia, and right down to Singapore. And we came into Singapore at a time you'd find these government warnings posted. Oh, first of all, we'll hitchhike down there. There's Maureen beside the road in Thailand. I should look at the next picture. Government warnings telling you males with long hair will be attended to last. If you were in Singapore in 72 and you had a haircut like that and you were male, you had to go to the back of the queue and wait until respectable, short-haired Singaporeans had all been served first. Wonderful country. Things have improved in all sorts of ways. And I have less hair now as well. But of course, in those days, we didn't have the low-cost carriers that whisk you around places now. So Maureen and I took a ferry over to Tanjung Penang in the Riau archipelago. There's Maureen on the ferry going over to Tanjung Penang, the palm trees behind. Now I look at it regularly as I fly into Changi, and it's a real symbol of Singapore because it's an industrial suburb of Singapore, really, even though it's Indonesia. There's a sign of things changing dramatically. There was a weekly ship that ran from Tanjung Penang to Jakarta. So we took that ship, we went to Jakarta, more buses, more trains. We got down to Bali, where I was last week, and we bumped into some New Zealanders with a yacht, and they said we need a couple more crew, and we joined them, and we sailed down to Australia. A trip that was supposed to take 16 days. It did take 16 days. It was supposed to take 6 days. But 16 days later, we arrived in Australia, having lost a little bit of weight on the way because we were running out of food on that boat. But when that photograph was taken, Maureen and I had been in Australia for about 2 minutes. And I've been saying subsequently in Australia, now if you arrive uninvited in Australia, now they ship you straight off to Nauru or somewhere. But in 1972, it was fine. And we hitchhiked again down to Perth and across to Sydney. And we got to Sydney, there was the Opera House, but in 72, the Opera House was still under construction. It wasn't finished yet. And during that next year, we lived in Sydney for a year, we decided to write a book about our travels, and that became the very first Lonely Planet guidebook. All of 96 pages, all of $1.80, and remarkably, it went so well that we decided, okay, I used to be an engineer before, now we're travel publishers. Now, my travels over the years and time passing over the years, I can sort of track the changes by looking at this annual selfie that Maureen and I do on our wedding anniversary, 7th of October every year. In the last couple of months, I've been on 2 sailing ships. I was on the red-sailed Indonesian Pinisi, sailing around the Komodo Islands of Indonesia, only 2 weeks ago. And a month ago, I was on the other ship, a sailing bark in the Mediterranean, a much larger ship, which we took from Malta to Venice. And during the course of that trip, Maureen's and my 44th wedding anniversary came up. We got a lot older. And there we are, 44 years married on the ship. And the other photograph was our wedding in 1971. That's what you wore to weddings in London in 71. End of the hippie trail era. But then our first wedding anniversary, we were at the Taj Mahal in India, October the 7th, 1972. 1973, we were living in Sydney, so we had the Sydney Opera House as our backdrop. But at the end of 73, we set off to travel to do our second guidebook, and we traveled all around Southeast Asia for the subsequent year. And where did we end up on our third wedding anniversary? At the Merlion. There we were, October the 7th, 1974, and I went there to the same spot just earlier this week and took another photograph, and it's another indication of how much Singapore has changed. Because no longer do you look out to sea from the Merlion, you look out to land, you look out to a large hotel, where I did stay for 2 days this week, and I did the obligatory lap of the 57th floor hotel. We spent all of 1974 traveling Southeast Asia. We bumped into all sorts of people, a Belgian cyclist who we met on a road in Java. We stayed in interesting hotels, the New China Hotel in Penang in Malaysia. And look, I think my hair was still un-Singapore approved at that time. But at the end of 1974, the beginning of 1975, we moved to Singapore and we settled down in the Palace Hotel at 407 Jalan Besar. There still is a hotel at 407 Jalan Besar, but it unfortunately bears no relation to that old hotel. And we stayed there for the next 3 months. And the second Lonely Planet guidebook was entirely produced on that little round table. Now, this is long before laptop computers and desktop publishing. You still had to have type set on long galleys, which you cut up and glued down on pages. And we did that on that little round table. We were there for 3 months, and we produced our second guidebook, Southeast Asia on a Shoestring. But what's interesting about that hotel room is a year later, the American author Bill Dalton came, and he wrote his Indonesia handbook, a classic guidebook, at that same table. So there have been 2 guidebooks, Southeast Asia on a Shoestring, which is now in its 17th edition and has sold well over 2 million copies. It's done very well for me. And Bill Dalton's Indonesia handbook were both written at 407 Jalan Besar. And I think if Singapore ever did blue historic plaques the way they do in London, maybe we could have one on 407 Jalan Besar saying 2 interesting guidebooks that lots of travelers have used were both written in this hotel. But the changes in Singapore over that period, one of the ways you can really track it is the exchange rate. Boy, that Singapore dollar is strong. If you look at the US dollar, it's worth, compared to the Singapore dollar, about half what it was worth back in 72. The Malaysian ringgit is only worth about 1/3 what it was worth. And the poor Indonesian rupiah, it's only worth 3% of what it was worth in 72. In 72, a Singapore dollar would buy you 290 rupiah. Now it'll buy you close to 10,000. Although sometimes I look at the prices in Singapore and I think maybe the Indonesians haven't got it so wrong. Now, William Gibson, his famous quote about Singapore, Disneyland with the death penalty, I think has been the most unpopular quote of Singapore in the last 43 years since I started coming here. And it's funny because William Gibson, he generally uses Japan. He said that Japan is the world's default image for the future. So in his cyberpunk novels, it's Japan that's often the vision of the future. But in Neuromancer, his 1984 novel, it was Singapore, Bencoolen Street, that pops up very early on in the book. But, you know, his talk about the death penalty cost me some money at one point. In 2006, I was on an international advisory panel to the Singapore Tourist Board, and I think I must have been paid $15,000 for that, because it popped up in my bank account as in Australia as $12,672.70, which I sent straight to Amnesty International. And they asked why that strange figure, and I said, well, the Singapore government gave it to me, and I think it can go to your work to help the Singapore government change its mind. So the Singapore government helped to finance Amnesty International's work at killing the death penalty everywhere in the world. Actually, I know it has gone down, its use of it, a lot in Singapore. But Singapore is still a country. Everything isn't all good in Singapore, which imprisons a lot of people. The last figure, actually, I think it's even worse than that, 220 people per 100,000 population, which makes it about the 60th worst in the world. Of course, it's nowhere near as bad as the US. The Americans are the world leaders of putting people in prison. But Singapore's in there with Azerbaijan, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Iran, Bahrain, Belarus, Russia, El Salvador, Turkmenistan. Not the sort of countries you want to be competing with in that sort of competition. And another thing that's not quite right in Singapore, countries with big banknotes, you know, they're either, the currency is going through the floor, which is why the Zimbabweans had a $100 trillion note. I've actually got one in my wallet. If I ever need to show someone a big banknote, I've got my $100 trillion note. But Singapore's got a $10,000 note. Why on earth? I mean, the only reason people have those sort of banknotes is to do bad things. You're money laundering or corruption or something. And I know that just last year, they announced they weren't going to print the $10,000 note anymore. The Indonesians have been really complaining about it. But there's a lot of corruption in Indonesia, and Singapore helps to finance it. But the spokesperson from the Monetary Authority of Singapore said, we're not going to print anymore, but we're not going to withdraw them. We're just going to wait till they wear out and returned. And I thought, wait a minute. In most countries in the world, it's the little notes, the US $1, the British £5 that wears out. In Singapore, I had this vision, people going into Starbucks and saying, oh, I've only got a $10,000 note, you know. It's a bit scrunched up, but, you know, do you mind if I pay for my coffee with a $10,000? I'm sure you've got change for it. This is Singapore. So I've been coming here for a long time, and for quite a few years I was coming back regularly to update the guidebooks. But I was here in 1981 with my daughter, Tashi. It was her first overseas trip. She came to Singapore. There she is, admiring Orchard Road. 1997, I was here with the photographer, Richard I. Anson. We were doing a book about the rickshaws, trishaws, becaks of Asia. They're still transport in many places. Singapore, they're just a tourist attraction now, but they're a colorful one. And it was a Singapore trishaw that ended up on the cover of that book. 2 years later, Richard and I were back again because we were doing a book about rice trails, the rice lands of Asia, mainly about the countries where it's grown. Well, you don't grow rice in Singapore, but you certainly eat lots of it. The last few days, I've had an Indian thali at Kamala Villas in Little India. I've had more rice with a North Indian biryani, and I've also had, of course, as I do every time in Singapore, that most important meal, Hainanese chicken rice. Rice a lot. I was here in 2009 to go to the Singapore Grand Prix. I was here in 2010, just when Marina Bay Sands opened. But my most interesting trip, not just to Singapore, but through Singapore in recent years, kicked off in 2005. I came to Singapore on my way to Shanghai, and I decided what I would do is connect Singapore with Asia, not by just getting on a plane and flying there, but by traveling to Shanghai at surface level, totally traveling at ground level. So I took the train out of Singapore. Unfortunately, that wonderful old railway station is gone now. It was closed in 2011. Traveled up through Malaysia, Thailand, into Cambodia, cross into Vietnam, mainly taking trains through Vietnam. That's my train coming in a way. But other forms of transport as well, on a motorcycle taxi in Hanoi. I got up to the China border and walked across the border from Lowcost to Hekou. And then across China, I mainly traveled by bus. And it seemed that every bus station I went into in China, the first thing I encountered was a sign of what could happen to you. They had these, every bus station had these postings of terrible bus accidents. You could be on that bus with its top ripped off and the bodies. I mean, it was truth in advertising, but it wasn't truth we wanted to know. But I did survive. I got all the way across to Putashan, and I then got on this overnight ship that took me up to Shanghai, and I came up the Pearl River in Shanghai, the perfect way to arrive there. It was a great trip, and Singapore was the jumping off point for that trip. Now, I come through Singapore a lot. I've actually got a home in London and a home in Australia, and I've been back and forth 4 times this year. Twice through Singapore with Singapore Airlines, but also through Dubai and also through Hong Kong. But I was thinking all this travel, and earlier this year I thought this is not the best way of traveling always. Get on here, jump off there, off to the next stop. All you ever see is the duty-free shops at Changi Airport. And I thought back to the very first flight I ever took. I was all of 1 year of age. That's the sort of planes you flew on when I said I was very old. My father was sent out to Karachi to work, and I lived in Karachi for the first 5 years of my life. And that first flight I took 3 days to get to Karachi, because you didn't fly at night. At night you stopped and stayed in a hotel and got back on the plane the next day and carried on. And I thought it'd be kind of interesting to try and sort of recreate that trip. Do a trip that didn't just jump on here and get off there, but make lots of stops along the way. So starting off in London, I flew on EasyJet and Ryanair and Pegasus and Fly Dubai and Air Arabia and Air Asia and SpiceJet and Vueling and Air Costa. 14 airlines later, I arrived in Singapore. It took me a month to get to Singapore. And then I carried on, and I took 8 more airlines to get down to Melbourne in Australia. 22 airlines from London. I had a great time. It was a lot of fun. And I came through Singapore that time. I flew in Jetstar from Penang. I flew out Tiger Air to Jakarta. And that's the story of my Singapore travels. And I'm sure I'm going to have lots more reasons to visit here in the future. Thank you very much.